I am Joshua, 34 years old, and my own parents secretly moved my golden brother into the house I just bought with my own life savings, changing the locks and throwing my boxes out on the street. Before I tell you about how I legally dismantled their entire lives and exposed their lies in front of the city's elite, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. I am curious to see how far this story travels. The smell of old brick, pine floorboards, and fresh paint was supposed to be my ultimate reward. I had just closed on a narrow, historic row home in Philadelphia. It certainly was not a massive mansion, but it was mine. Every single square inch of it belonged to me. For 12 grueling years, I worked endless overtime shifts, skipped every major holiday vacation, and passed up almost every single luxury just to save up for the down payment. I even delayed pushing for a major promotion at the museum where I work as a records manager. I did that simply because I needed the guaranteed overtime salary to make my math work perfectly. I was exhausted to my very core, but standing in that empty living room, holding a set of heavy brass keys, I finally felt like my life belonged to me. I had a place in this world. I wasn't even fully moved in yet. Half my boxes were still taped shut with heavy-duty packing tape, sitting in the corner of my cramped, poorly lit rental apartment across town. I was sleeping on a cheap plastic air mattress in the new house, wanting to save up a little more of my salary before buying proper, comfortable furniture. That Tuesday morning, the air was crisp and full of promise. I was standing in the kitchen, measuring the wall for some custom oak bookshelves, when my cell phone rang. It was my dad. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how my first night in the new house was. He didn't ask if I needed help unpacking. "You need to come get your things," he said. His voice was completely flat, carrying that absolute, unyielding authority he only ever used on me, never on my younger brother. "Your brother needs the house more than you do." I actually laughed. It was a short, sharp, confused sound. The sentence was so completely outrageous, so entirely disconnected from reality, that my brain couldn't process it as truth. I thought it was some kind of terrible, heavy-handed joke. Then my mother got on the speakerphone. Her voice was unsettlingly calm, the kind of voice she used when she wanted to smooth over one of my brother's massive mistakes. "This is Carter's home now, Joshua. Be mature about it." In the background, through the tiny speaker of my phone, I heard the undeniable sounds of a house in heavy motion. Cabinet doors were opening and closing with loud thuds. Heavy footsteps echoed on hardwood floors. And then I heard my younger brother, Carter. His voice was light, smug, and completely at home. "You're not welcome here, so don't make this ugly," Carter called out toward the phone. My stomach dropped so hard I felt physically sick. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breathing stopped. They weren't asking for a favor. They weren't negotiating. They were already inside the house. My mind raced at 1,000,000 miles an hour trying to put the pieces together. The lockbox. I had left a spare key in a coded lockbox on the side door for a plumber who was supposed to check the water heater later that week. I had casually mentioned the code to a friend of mine, Qley, who sometimes checked on my cat at the old apartment. I later found out Qley, who always had a soft spot for Carter's charming, victim-playing acts, had run into him at a local coffee shop. He spun her a massive, detailed lie about me having a plumbing emergency and needing the code to help me out. She handed over the code without a second thought. I left the house immediately. I didn't even grab my measuring tape. I drove back to my old apartment, my hands shaking violently on the steering wheel. The sky was turning a dark, bruised gray, threatening rain. When I pulled up to the curb outside my old building, my breath caught in my throat. 3 of my large moving boxes I had meticulously packed with my heavy winter clothes and expensive kitchenware, were sitting on the wet concrete sidewalk next to the gutter, like trash. They had used my key, entered my property while I was away at work, and literally thrown my personal belongings out onto the street to make room for my brother. My entire future, the one I had bled for, was being handed over like a simple family favor. I stood on the sidewalk, rain starting to mist against my face, staring at a cardboard box that had my name written on it in thick black marker. I didn't scream. I didn't call them back. A cold, hard realization settled over my chest. They thought I was invisible. They thought I would just absorb this injustice quietly, like I always did. But they were wrong. Back inside my cramped, dimly lit apartment, I didn't cry. I know that sounds strange to some people, but I was entirely too stunned for tears. As a records manager for a historical museum, my entire professional life is built on meticulous documentation, establishing chain of custody, and requiring absolute proof. I track what belongs to whom, where it came from, and what happens when someone touches a priceless artifact they have absolutely no right to touch. That night, sitting on my worn-out, uncomfortable sofa, I stopped thinking like a wounded son and started thinking like a forensic auditor preparing for a major trial. I pulled out a heavy plastic storage bin from under my bed. Inside was a large hard drive full of digitized family videos I had been meaning to organize for months. I wasn't looking for warm nostalgia. I was looking for behavioral patterns. I was looking for undeniable proof that I hadn't lost my mind over the years. I clicked open a video file from 15 years ago. On the screen, I was 18 years old, sitting at the kitchen table sorting through college brochures with genuine excitement. My parents had just sat me down to explain that the college fund they had explicitly promised me since I was a child was entirely gone. They had drained the account to pay off a massive credit card debt. Carter had recklessly racked up buying designer clothes and taking his high school girlfriend on lavish, unnecessary trips. In the video, my mother is patting my shoulder, looking right into the camera, and telling me I was the strong one, and that I could easily get student loans to cover my education. I clicked another file. 3 years later, I was in the background of a wide driveway shot, wearing a cheap, stained uniform from my second evening job, washing my beat-up used sedan with a bucket and sponge. The camera suddenly pans rapidly to Carter. My parents had just surprised him with a certified pre-owned Porsche. It wasn't brand new, but it was a shiny, expensive Porsche. They had secretly taken out a second mortgage on their own home just to buy it for him, so he wouldn't feel left behind by his wealthy fraternity brothers at his expensive private university. It was never one massive, dramatic betrayal before this house incident. It was 1,000 tiny, quiet edits to our family narrative, repeated over decades, until I became the family workhorse expected to sacrifice everything, and Carter became the fragile golden idol who needed constant financial and emotional protection. On the fourth night after the terrible phone call, I couldn't take the suffocating silence in my apartment anymore. I grabbed my car keys, got in my car, and drove past my new house. I parked a full block away, turned off my headlights, and walked up the sidewalk under the cover of darkness. My porch light was on. It illuminated a fancy, expensive floral wreath hanging on the front door. A wreath I had certainly not bought. Through the slightly open living room window, a loud, booming laugh floated out into the cool night air. It was Carter. I could hear his wife, Emily, talking happily about picking out new paint colors for the master bedroom. Emily was generally a good person, a registered nurse who worked long, grueling hours. She had always been kind to me, but she was deeply, blindly under Carter's manipulative spell. I pulled out my phone and opened the doorbell camera app one had installed the very day I closed on the house. I hadn't synced it to my main push notifications yet, but the cloud storage was actively recording. I scrolled back the timeline to Tuesday. There it was in crisp, undeniable high definition. Carter punching the stolen code into the lockbox. My father struggling to carry in my brother's heavy golf clubs. My mother actively directing moving men who were carrying Emily's antique furniture through my front door. And there was Carter, physically picking up my carefully taped boxes and hauling them out to the trunk of his car, only to dump them outside my apartment later. They had perfectly documented their own illegal trespass. The next morning, I didn't call my parents to beg or argue. I called a man named Matthew. Matthew was an aggressive, razor-sharp real estate lawyer I had met during a complex museum property acquisition. I sat in his heavy leather chair, slid my phone across his polished mahogany desk, and played the security video. Then I handed him my official closing documents and the property deed. Matthew watched the footage in silence, carefully reviewed the deed, and then looked directly at me. "Do not warn them," he said, his voice completely level and devoid of emotion. "Let them get very comfortable. Let them unpack their lives. Gather every single text message, every social media post, every receipt. We are going to build a massive wall of paper they cannot possibly climb over." For the next 10 agonizing days, I was a complete ghost. My mother sent exactly one text message. "Hope you've cooled down by now. Family is everything. We should do dinner soon." I didn't reply. Carter, however, was far from silent. He posted a highly filtered photo on his Facebook page of himself standing in the center of my kitchen, holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch. The caption was sickening. "Finally settled into our forever dream home. So incredibly blessed to have amazing parents who stepped up when others turned their backs on us." I calmly screenshotted the post, printed it out in full color, and placed it neatly into a thick, black legal binder. By the end of the second week, the digital invitation began circulating online. Emily, who was completely oblivious to the criminal reality of their living situation, had created a public event page, Carter and Emily's Grand Housewarming. It was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. They were literally throwing a massive party to celebrate moving into a house they had stolen from me. Saturday finally arrived. I dressed carefully in a sharp, tailored navy suit I usually reserved for high-end museum galas and donor meetings. I pulled up to my own house at exactly 3:45 p.m. Cars lined both sides of the narrow street. I recognized my Aunt Clara's silver sedan, my parents' luxury SUV, and dozens of unfamiliar, expensive vehicles belonging to Carter's country club friends and Emily's nursing colleagues. I walked slowly up the front steps, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs, and pushed the front door open. I didn't knock. It was my door. The house smelled strongly of expensive catered barbecue, artificial vanilla candles, and the floral perfume my mother always wore. At least 40 people were packed tightly into the living room and kitchen areas. Aunt Clara was the very first person to see me. She nudged my mother, who gasped and nearly dropped her expensive crystal wine glass onto the hardwood. My father stiffened near the granite kitchen island, his face draining of color. Carter was holding court by the brick fireplace, telling a loud story. He stopped mid-sentence when he caught sight of me. He immediately puffed out his chest, stepping forward aggressively to block my path into the room. "What the hell are you doing here?" he hissed, keeping his voice just low enough that only the people closest to us could hear the venom in his tone. "Enjoying the party," I said evenly, keeping my face a completely blank mask. I walked right past him, forcing him to step aside, and headed straight to the large dining table, which was currently covered in expensive catered appetizers. I calmly swept a heavy silver platter of cheese out of the way, creating a large, clear space on the polished oak wood. The room started to go dead quiet. Conversations trailed off into nervous whispers as people noticed the heavy tension radiating from our family. "Look," Carter said, raising his voice now, clearly playing the victim to the large crowd. "I know you're bitter. You never lifted a single finger while Emily and I were struggling with our terrible old lease. You never helped this family when it counts. But showing up here today just to ruin our special day? That's truly pathetic, Joshua." My mother rushed forward, her hands fluttering nervously. "Joshua, please, not in front of all these guests. Let's go talk outside on the patio like adults." "No," I said, my voice echoing clearly off the hardwood floors and silencing the remaining whispers. "We're going to talk right here, in front of everyone." I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick black binder. I took out 3 pieces of crisp white paper and laid them side by side on the table. "Since everyone is here celebrating this beautiful home," I announced to the dead silent room, making eye contact with the guests. I figured I should properly introduce myself to Carter's friends. "I am Joshua, and I am the sole legal owner of this property." A collective, sharp gasp rippled through the crowded room. Carter's face flushed a dark, angry red. "You're completely out of your mind. Dad bought this house for us. He put the down payment down." "Did he?" I asked calmly, I tapped the first document with my index finger. This is the official property deed. Sole owner, Joshua. This is the mortgage agreement. Sole borrower, paying out of my own salary, Joshua. I tapped the second document. This is a printed still from my security camera showing you illegally trespassing using a stolen lockbox code while I was at work. Right on cue, the heavy front door opened again. Matthew, my lawyer, walked in wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, carrying a sleek leather legal folder. "And this?" Matthew said, his voice booming with absolute authority as he stepped up to the table and dropped an official legal notice directly in front of Carter's chest. "Is a formal demand for immediate surrender of the property. You have zero legal right to be here. You are trespassing. Every single day you remain on this property will incur severe financial penalties and potential criminal charges." Emily pushed her way to the front of the crowd. Her face was chalk white, her eyes darting frantically between me, Carter, and the legal documents on the table. She looked closely at the deed, seeing my name printed clearly at the top. She turned to Carter, her voice trembling violently. "Wait, you told me your parents co-owned this place. You told me Joshua happily agreed to let us stay here because he got a sudden job transfer and didn't need the space." Carter stammered, sweating profusely, looking desperately at our father for help. My father simply stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "Did you lie to me?" Emily screamed, the sound raw and echoing off the walls. "I did what I had to do for our family," Carter yelled back, losing his composure completely and slamming his hand on the table. I looked at Emily with genuine pity. "He lied to you, just like my parents lied to themselves for 30 years. I turned back to the crowd of stunned, silent guests. "The party is over. Please leave my house immediately." I sincerely wish I could say they packed their bags that very night out of sheer embarrassment, but entitled people rarely retreat when their lies are exposed. They almost always lash out with double the ferocity. The party guests fled the house like the building was actively on fire, muttering excuses and avoiding eye contact, but Carter absolutely refused to leave. He literally barricaded the front door from the inside, and because he had unfortunately established temporary residency by moving his furniture in and receiving official mail there for 2 straight weeks, the local police told me it was strictly a civil matter. I had to go through the lengthy, formal eviction process through the courts. Matthew warned me it would take at least 30 to 45 days to get a sheriff to physically remove them. Carter decided to use that time to wage total war. If he couldn't have the house, he decided he was going to make me deeply regret owning it. A week after the disastrous party, a concerned neighbor called my cell phone. There was a shady-looking contractor's van parked illegally in my driveway, and the loud, destructive sound of sledgehammers was echoing down the street. I rushed over immediately and found a sleazy, unlicensed contractor named Marcus actively tearing out the original 1920s solid mahogany built-in bookshelves in the study, the very architectural detail that was the main reason I fell in love with the house in the first place. I stormed inside and ordered Marcus off the property immediately, threatening to have him arrested for vandalism and trespassing, but the tragic damage was already done. The beautiful, historic wood was splintered and destroyed on the floor. Carter stood lazily in the doorway, smirking, holding a cup of coffee. "Just doing some remodeling, bro. The place needed a modern touch. It felt too old." I didn't scream at him. I didn't throw a punch. I simply took out my phone and meticulously photographed every single splinter of wood, every gouge in the drywall, every piece of debris. I sent the high-resolution photos straight to Matthew's office. Every broken shelf was another massive $sign added to the impending civil lawsuit. But Carter's ultimate, unforgivable act of spite was yet to come. I had a beautiful, ornate antique silver mirror, a priceless piece of inheritance from our late grandmother. She had explicitly left it to me in her will because I was the only grandchild who used to sit and help her carefully polish it on Sunday afternoons. I had carefully packed it in a protective wooden crate, which the movers had shoved into the basement during the illegal move-in. 2 weeks into the tense eviction process, I received an email from a highly unexpected source. "Mr. Harrison, a retired history teacher who frequently visited the museum where I worked and shared my love for antiques, sent me an urgent message. He attached a screenshot from a local online marketplace. Joshua, isn't this the exact 19th century silver mirror you showed me photos of last year? Some guy named Carter is selling it online for an absolute fraction of its true historical value. I just bought it to save it from going to a pawn shop, but I wanted to check with you first to see if you were actually selling it. My blood ran ice cold. Carter had literally stolen my family inheritance to make a quick buck to fund his legal defense. I called Mr. Harrison immediately, my hands shaking with pure rage. He was absolutely appalled when I calmly explained the truth of the situation. He readily agreed to hold onto the mirror safely at his home and act as a formal witness for the theft. I forwarded the digital receipt and Mr. Harrison's written statement directly to Matthew. We immediately filed an amended legal complaint with the courts. We weren't just going for a standard eviction anymore. We filed for wrongful occupancy, massive property damage, and the criminal conversion of stolen property. During our deep dive into his records, we also discovered Carter had officially changed the mailing address of his failing, scam-like online consulting business to my house, illegally using my residential property for commercial purposes to completely dodge his old landlord's aggressive debt collectors. Matthew ruthlessly secured an emergency preservation order from a stern judge. It was a terrifying, binding legal document warning them that any further destruction of property, unauthorized sales, or deletion of social media posts would result in immediate, severe contempt of court charges and possible jail time. My father called me the very day they were served the massive, intimidating stack of legal papers by a process server. His voice shook with genuine panic. Joshua, please, you're completely ruining your brother's life. He could go to jail. We can handle this privately as a family. You completely lost the right to privacy the day you threw my entire life onto the wet sidewalk like garbage. I told him, and hung up the phone without another word. I was currently preparing for the biggest professional night of my entire life. My brilliant colleague David and I were hosting a major, high-profile exhibition at the museum called What Survives, focusing strictly on provenance, stolen art, and the complex ethics of historical ownership. It was meant to be a quiet, dignified academic evening for rich donors. But I knew my brother Carter. I knew he was rapidly unraveling under the legal pressure. And I knew he absolutely wouldn't be able to resist crashing a public stage to try and play the victim one last time. The museum's grand exhibition hall was bathed in warm, expensive amber light. Dozens of wealthy philanthropists, city officials, and local arts journalists mingled around reinforced glass display cases holding recovered artifacts. I stood near the main oak podium in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, a wireless microphone clipped securely to my lapel. My career was about to take a massive leap forward. I was up for a major promotion based entirely on the success of this event. At exactly 7:30 p.m., just as I was preparing to give the keynote address, the heavy oak doors of the grand hall swung violently open. Carter walked in. He was wearing a wrinkled, poorly fitting blazer, looking sweaty and completely unhinged. My mother trailed nervously behind him, looking absolutely terrified of the wealthy crowd, and Emily was there too, keeping a massive physical distance from Carter, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. Carter had clearly dragged them all here for a final, desperate, dramatic showdown. He thrived on chaotic public scenes, foolishly believing he could bully me into submission and force me to drop the lawsuit if he humiliated me in front of my bosses and the city's elite. He marched straight down the center aisle of the room, loudly talking over the elegant string quartet playing in the corner. "Look at him," Carter shouted, pointing an accusatory finger directly at me on the stage. The music screeched to an awkward, terrible halt. Dozens of wealthy guests turned around, their expensive champagne flutes frozen in midair. Mrs. Grayson, one of the most powerful and ruthless members of the museum's board of directors, narrowed her sharp eyes at the intrusion. "He stands up there talking about ethics and history," Carter sneered, pacing the polished floor like a caged animal. "But he's actively throwing his own flesh and blood family out on the street. He stole the house my parents bought for me. He's a complete fraud and a terrible brother. Shocked murmurs erupted through the dressed-up crowd. My mother buried her face in her hands, realizing the massive mistake they had made by coming here. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I had anticipated this exact, pathetic moment. I looked back at David, who was standing by the tech booth controlling the audiovisual presentation. I gave him a single, curt nod. I stepped fully up to the podium and tapped the microphone, the sound booming through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing with terrifying, absolute calm. "My brother brings up a truly fascinating point about stolen property and ethics. Since the entire theme of tonight's exhibition is what survives and the importance of establishing true ownership, let's take a look at the actual documentation." Behind me, the massive digital projector screen, which had been displaying high-resolution images of antique Roman artifacts, suddenly went pitch black. Then, it lit up with a massive, undeniable high-resolution scan of my property deed. "This is the official legal deed to my home, purchased entirely with my own hard-earned salary," I said, pacing slowly across the stage. The screen clicked instantly to the next slide. It was a detailed breakdown of the fraudulent business registration. "This is the public state record of Carter illegally using my private residential address to hide his failing business from aggressive creditors." Carter stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw literally dropped open. He hadn't expected me to bring the legal war to a 40-foot screen in front of billionaires. The slide clicked again. It clearly showed the devastating photos of the destroyed mahogany built-ins right next to Marcus's ridiculous, incriminating text messages. "This is the intentional, malicious destruction of original 1920s architecture, simply out of petty spite." And finally, the screen flashed to the digital receipt of the antique mirror, next to a blown-up copy of the email from Mr. Harrison. "And this is absolute proof of the blatant theft and unauthorized sale of a precious family inheritance." The silence in the massive grand hall was absolute and heavy. You could clearly hear the low hum of the air conditioning units. The city's elite stared down at my brother not with pity, but with absolute, unadulterated disgust. Emily, who had been standing silently near the back doors, suddenly stepped forward into the light. Her face was heavily streaked with mascara and tears, but her eyes were furious and burning with rage. She looked at the damning evidence on the screen, then turned to Carter. "You told me it was a massive misunderstanding," she sobbed, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "You swore to me he was trying to extort us for money. You stole his dead grandmother's mirror to pay your sleazy lawyer." "Emily, baby, wait. I can explain." Carter desperately reached out for her arm. She slapped his hand away with brutal force. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Don't you ever touch me again. I am completely done, Carter. I am calling a divorce lawyer first thing tomorrow morning. And you are not getting custody of the kids until you get serious psychiatric help." She turned, looked at me with deep, agonizing shame, whispered, "I am so incredibly sorry, Joshua," and ran out the heavy oak doors into the night. Carter stood there, entirely stripped of his fake armor. His wife was gone. His reputation was incinerated. His pathetic lies were projected in 40-foot letters for the world to see. He looked frantically at my mother, but for the very first time in his entire pampered life, she didn't rush forward to comfort him. She was staring frozen at Mrs. Grayson, realizing the absolute social and financial suicide they had just committed. Carter turned and fled the room, practically tripping over his own feet in his rush to escape the judging stares. My mother hurried after him, covering her face in total humiliation. I looked back out at the stunned crowd. Mrs. Grayson slowly raised her crystal glass of champagne to me in a silent, powerful gesture of profound respect. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far with me. You are amazing. Please help me like the video and leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you've been with me this far. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The following Tuesday morning was official eviction day. I pulled my car up to the front of the house at 8 a.m. sharp. Matthew, my lawyer, was already there, standing tall next to Sheriff Reynolds, a massive, no-nonsense law enforcement officer who had absolutely zero patience for messy family drama. When the sheriff pounded his heavy fist on the front door, Carter opened it looking like an absolute ghost of a human being. He was completely unshaven, wearing dirty sweatpants, and reeked heavily of stale beer and defeat. Without Emily's steady nursing income, and with his consulting business completely frozen due to the aggressive legal injunctions we had filed, he literally had nowhere else to go. My parents had been desperately forced to rent him a cheap, run-down motel room on the absolute edge of town. I stood silently on the sidewalk with my arms crossed tightly over my chest as Carter hauled black plastic trash bags full of his dirty clothes out to his car. He didn't dare look at me once. There were no more smug smiles, no more arrogant, empty threats. He was entirely, thoroughly broken by the heavy weight of his own terrible consequences. Once his car finally pulled away from the curb, Sheriff Reynolds handed me the shiny brass keys. "It's all yours, son. Change the locks today. Don't let them back in." I walked into the house completely alone. It was dead silent. The sickening smell of cheap vanilla candles and stale beer lingered heavily in the air. The place was an absolute disaster zone. There were massive scuff marks on the newly painted hallway walls. The beautiful study was a war zone of splintered wood and exposed nails, and they had left a literal mountain of rotting garbage in the kitchen sink. But as I stood perfectly still in the center of the living room, breathing in the dusty, stale air, I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt an overwhelming, incredible sense of peace wash over my entire body. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family's toxic expectations had finally been lifted entirely off my chest. I had fought a brutal war for my space, and I had won. Later that afternoon, a small delivery truck pulled up to the curb. It was Mr. Harrison. He carefully carried the heavy wooden crate containing my grandmother's silver mirror up the front steps. I happily paid him back every single cent he had spent on the ridiculous online marketplace, plus a very generous extra tip for his immense trouble and honesty. As I hung the beautiful, polished silver mirror above the brick fireplace, catching my own reflection in the antique glass, I finally recognized the strong man looking back at me. He was no longer the invisible, compliant son who absorbed everyone's pain. The financial fallout for my parents was absolutely catastrophic. Matthew didn't let up on the civil suit for a second. Because Carter was effectively bankrupt and facing a brutal divorce, the massive financial liability for the property damage, the stolen inheritance, and the exorbitant legal fees fell entirely on the people who had actively facilitated the trespass and handed over the key, my parents. My Aunt Clara called me a week later. It was the very first time I had spoken to her since the disastrous housewarming party. She was crying hysterically into the phone. "Joshua, you have to tell your lawyer to drop the lawsuit," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "It's like an actual funeral over here. Your parents are selling the lake cabin." I paused, holding the phone to my ear. The lake cabin. It was their most prized possession, their ultimate retirement dream, the beautiful place they spent every single summer boasting about to their wealthy friends. "They have to sell it," Aunt Clara sobbed loudly. "They drained all their liquid savings years ago paying for Carter's stupid Porsche and constantly bailing him out of his massive credit card debt. They have absolutely nothing left in the bank to pay your legal settlement. They're going to lose the cabin and they might have to downsize their own house." I looked around my quiet, peaceful living room, sunlight streaming through the windows. I thought deeply about the 12 years I spent working grueling holidays, missing out on my own life, eating cheap meals, while they poured all their wealth and love into a son who repaid them by aggressively destroying everything he touched. "Actions have consequences, Aunt Clara," I said softly but firmly. "They bought him a Porsche. Now they are buying him a lawsuit. Tell them I expect the settlement check by the end of the month." I hung up the phone, walked into my kitchen, and started making a fresh cup of coffee. The house was finally mine. and the silence had never sounded so incredibly beautiful. 3 months passed. 3 months of absolute, uninterrupted silence from the people who had spent my entire life telling me I owed them everything. If you have ever been forced to cut ties with deeply toxic family members, you know exactly what the first few weeks of that separation feel like. It is a very strange, hollow kind of quiet. You keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. You keep checking your phone, feeling a spike of anxiety every time the screen lights up, fully expecting an angry text message, a manipulative voicemail, or a surprise visit at your front door. But when you build a massive wall out of solid, undeniable legal consequences, that terrifying silence eventually turns into genuine, lasting peace. Autumn officially arrived in Philadelphia, turning the heavy trees lining my narrow, historic street into brilliant shades of gold and burnt orange. The crisp, cool air sweeping through the city felt like a physical representation of the massive changes happening in my daily life. I wasn't just existing anymore, holding my breath and waiting for the next family disaster. I was finally building something that belonged entirely to me. The physical restoration of my row home became my daily therapy. I didn't rush the complicated process. I took the massive settlement check I received from my parents, the money they were legally forced to pay for Carter's malicious vandalism and reckless destruction, and I hired the absolute best ethical, fully licensed craftsmen in the city. I spent my precious weekend mornings at specialty architectural salvage yards, running my hands over massive slabs of reclaimed mahogany. I was absolutely determined to perfectly replace the beautiful 1920s built-in bookshelves that Carter's sleazy, unlicensed contractor had violently smashed to pieces with a sledgehammer. When those new custom shelves were finally installed in my study, filling the room with the rich, comforting smell of dark wood stain and fresh lemon oil, I spent an entire Sunday afternoon carefully organizing my massive collection of historical books. I hired a professional to securely hang my grandmother's antique silver mirror squarely over the exposed brick fireplace in the living room. That mirror was the physical manifestation of my inheritance, the exact item my brother had coldly stolen and sold for quick cash. Now it was back where it belonged. Every single time I walked past it and caught my reflection in the old, slightly warped glass, I saw a man who had fought a brutal, exhausting war for his own dignity and had actually won. The house didn't feel tainted by their brief, illegal occupation anymore. The negative energy was gone, felt entirely, unquestionably mine. But the incredible transformation in my personal life was absolutely nothing compared to the massive explosion that happened in my professional career. Do you remember Mrs. Grayson, the incredibly wealthy, powerful museum board member who had silently witnessed Carter's humiliating public meltdown at my exhibition? 2 days after that chaotic event, her executive assistant called my office extension and formally asked me to come up to the top floor of the museum's administrative building. I walked into her massive, glass-walled corner office feeling incredibly nervous, my palms actually sweating. I honestly thought she was going to formally reprimand me, or perhaps even fire me, for bringing messy, dramatic family baggage into a high-society museum event filled with billionaire donors. Instead, she warmly motioned for me to sit down in a heavy, expensive leather chair directly opposite her polished desk. She didn't offer me tea or engage in meaningless small talk. She looked at me with sharp, highly calculating eyes. "Joshua," she said, her voice dripping with the quiet, absolute authority of old money. "I have sat on the executive board of this museum for 22 years. In my private business, I have dealt with international art thieves, highly skilled fraudulent historians, and pathological liars who would sell their own mothers for a painting. What you did the other night in that exhibition hall, methodically, legally dismantling a con artist using absolutely nothing but irrefutable documentation and absolute, terrifying composure, was the most impressive thing I have seen in a decade." I blinked, completely caught off guard by the praise. "Thank you, Mrs. Grayson, but I still deeply apologize for the public scene. My brother is difficult. Do not ever apologize for surviving," she snapped back instantly, though her eyes were kind. She opened a thick, highly organized manila folder on her desk. "I don't just sit on this museum board. I am the managing director of a private wealth management firm that specializes in acquiring, authenticating, and protecting historical estates for extremely wealthy clients. We constantly deal with messy inheritance disputes, incredibly convincing fake documents, and greedy relatives trying to steal massive fortunes from each other. I desperately need someone on my payroll with your exact set of skills. I need someone who deeply understands provenance, someone who respects the absolute chain of custody, and most importantly, someone who does not intimidate easily under immense pressure. Right then and there, looking out over the Philadelphia skyline, she offered me a position as the lead independent historical consultant for her private firm. It wasn't just a simple promotion. It was an entirely new, elite stratosphere of a career. She casually wrote down a starting salary on a piece of heavy cardstock and slid it across the desk toward me. I stared at the number, and my jaw literally dropped. It was triple what I was making at the museum with full benefits and a massive travel budget. I accepted the job immediately, shaking her hand firmly. Within a matter of weeks, my entire daily routine transformed. I was suddenly traveling first class across the country to review highly secretive private collections, authenticating centuries-old documents, and working aggressively alongside top-tier estate lawyers. I was finally being aggressively compensated and highly respected for the exact meticulous, detail-oriented nature my family had always actively mocked me for. While my life was rapidly ascending to heights I never thought possible, the karmic justice raining down on my family was absolutely biblical in its scale and severity. Matthew, my ruthless and brilliant real estate lawyer, kept me fully updated on the ongoing legal and financial fallout. Because Carter was effectively unemployed, deeply in credit card debt, and facing a brutal, highly publicized divorce, he had absolutely zero financial assets for the courts to seize. Therefore, the massive financial liability for the property damage, the criminal theft of the antique mirror, and the exorbitant legal fees fell entirely on the people who had actively facilitated the illegal trespass and physically handed over the stolen key. That meant my parents. They had to pay the piper, and the piper's bill was incredibly expensive. Through my Aunt Clara, who simply could not stop leaving me gossipy, tearful voicemails despite my strict boundaries, I learned the exact, agonizing details of my parents' financial ruin. My parents had spent the last 10 years projecting a flawless image of upper-middle-class perfection to their snobby country club friends. But it was all a highly fragile house of cards built on massive, suffocating debt. They had secretly drained all their liquid savings years ago. I finally learned the full, sickening truth. The generous college fund they had promised me since I was a child wasn't just lost to a bad investment. They had actively drained my entire college fund to pay off Carter's insane luxury credit card bills when he was 21. Then, a few years later, they took out a massive, highly risky second mortgage on their primary suburban home just to buy him that ridiculous, depreciating Porsche. When Matthew's firm legally forced them to pay my massive settlement for the house damages, they looked at their bank accounts and hit a solid brick wall. They had absolutely nothing left. They were violently forced by the courts to list their beloved lake cabin for sale. This wasn't just a simple piece of vacation property to them. It was their ultimate, crowning status symbol. It was the beautiful, serene summer home they spent decades aggressively boasting about at every single dinner party and church gathering. Because of the strict legal deadlines we imposed, they had to sell it in a massive panic, settling for a price incredibly under market value, to a cold corporate developer who immediately planned to tear the beautiful cabin down to build condos. Aunt Clara left a sobbing voicemail telling me my mother had completely broken down, crying hysterically on the front lawn the day the new corporate owners arrived to change the locks. I felt a brief, tiny twinge of natural human pity, but it vanished into thin air the absolute second I remembered the cold, uncaring, entitled look on her face when she told me my house belonged to Carter now. They had aggressively gambled their entire retirement, their financial security, and their relationship with me on the golden child, assuming the invisible, highly reliable workhorse child would just quietly absorb the massive loss. They lost the gamble and they lost everything. Carter's life completely dissolved into absolute, unmitigated misery. Emily fully followed through on her furious promise at the museum. She officially filed for a brutal, highly aggressive divorce the very next morning. She hired a truly ruthless family lawyer who expertly used the documented police reports of Carter's trespassing, his malicious property destruction, and his criminal theft to completely obliterate his character in family court. Carter lost the custody battle entirely. The judge was absolutely appalled by his documented behavior. The court granted him severely limited, legally supervised visitation with his children, specifically citing his volatile, destructive behavior, his chronic lying, and his total lack of stable housing. Without Emily's steady, reliable nursing income to prop up his fake lifestyle, he was quickly forced to move out of the cheap motel my parents were paying for. He ended up renting a tiny, depressing, incredibly cramped studio apartment in a terrible high-crime neighborhood on the absolute outskirts of the city. He desperately tried to keep up his fake, wealthy persona on social media for a few pathetic weeks, heavily filtering old pictures of his country club meals and posting vague, inspirational quotes about overcoming haters. But everyone in their social circle already knew the humiliating, undeniable truth. His friends stopped commenting. His former business partners publicly distanced themselves. Eventually, the crushing shame became too much, and he deleted his social media profiles entirely. The golden boy had permanently lost his shine, and nobody was there to polish him back up. To officially celebrate the permanent closing of this incredibly dark chapter of my life, I decided to host a real, genuine dinner party at my newly restored house. I didn't invite 50 strangers just to show off. I didn't buy cheap, artificial vanilla candles to mask the smell of lies. I invited the specific people who had actually stood shoulder to shoulder with me when the sky was violently falling. I invited David, my brilliant museum colleague who had seamlessly run the projector during the ultimate showdown. I invited Matthew, my lawyer, who arrived wearing a surprisingly casual cashmere sweater instead of his usual intimidating, razor-sharp legal armor. And I invited Mr. Harrison, the incredibly kind, highly perceptive retired history teacher who had saved my grandmother's mirror from being lost to a pawn shop forever. I spent all of Saturday happily cooking in my massive new kitchen. I roasted a massive, expensive prime rib with fresh rosemary and garlic. I bought incredible, highly rated red wine. We sat around my large, solid oak dining room table, completely surrounded by the beautiful, newly restored mahogany shelves, and we simply laughed. The sound echoed warmly off the brick walls. We didn't talk about Carter's misery. We didn't talk about the grueling lawsuit or the eviction. We talked passionately about art, about ancient history, about local politics, and about the bright future. As I looked around the warm, brightly lit table at these incredibly intelligent, fiercely loyal people, I realized something truly profound. Family isn't just the random people who happen to share your DNA. Blood does not automatically grant someone a permanent, unquestionable VIP pass to your life, especially if they constantly use that pass to steal your peace, your money, and your mental health. True family is the specific group of people who deeply respect your boundaries, who loudly celebrate your genuine success without a shred of jealousy, and who stand right next to you, ready to fight, when the world gets incredibly dark. I raised my crystal glass of red wine, the firelight catching the deep red liquid. "To what survives?" I said, intentionally echoing the title of the museum exhibition that had fundamentally changed the trajectory of my entire life. The three men at the table smiled deeply and raised their glasses in unison. "To what survives?" they echoed back. Deep winter settled heavily over Philadelphia, bringing biting, freezing winds and a thick, heavy blanket of bright white snow that finally buried the last remaining visual traces of that terrible autumn. I was incredibly busy with my demanding new consulting job, earning a fantastic salary, and traveling constantly to beautiful cities across the globe. I hadn't spoken a single solitary word to my parents or my brother in nearly 5 full months. My life was wonderfully, blissfully quiet. Then, on a freezing Tuesday morning in late January, my cell phone buzzed aggressively on my heavy office desk. I glanced down. It was a text message from my father. "Joshua, please, we desperately need to see you, just for 30 minutes. Your mother is completely falling apart physically and mentally. We are begging you. Please have a heart." I leaned back in my chair and stared at the glowing screen for a very long time. 6 months ago, a dramatic, pleading message exactly like that would have instantly triggered a massive, overwhelming wave of programmed guilt. I would have dropped everything I was doing, canceled my meetings, rushed blindly to their side, and desperately tried to fix whatever new, catastrophic mess Carter had created. But the confident, highly successful man reading that text message today was absolutely not the same traumatized, invisible man they had cruelly kicked out of his own home months ago. I didn't want a relationship with them. I knew in my bones that they hadn't fundamentally changed who they were. But I also knew with absolute certainty that if I didn't look them directly in the eye and officially, permanently close the door to my life, they would keep hovering desperately on the edges of my existence like starving ghosts, constantly trying to find a weak point in my newly forged armor. I picked up the phone and typed back a brief, incredibly cold reply. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m. The coffee shop on 4th and Market. Exactly 30 minutes. Do not bring him." The next morning, the city was completely covered in thick, gray slush. I bundled up in a heavy wool coat and walked into the busy, brightly lit, entirely neutral coffee shop exactly on time. I deliberately chose a highly public, crowded place so they couldn't scream, throw a highly theatrical tantrum, or try to emotionally manipulate me in the privacy of a quiet room. I bought a simple black coffee and sat down at a small, round corner table, watching the door. Exactly 5 minutes later, the front door chimed loudly, and my parents walked in out of the freezing wind. I almost didn't recognize them. The intense physical toll of the last few months of extreme stress and financial ruin was absolutely staggering. My father, who had always stood with the arrogant, puffed-out chest of a wealthy, untouchable country club member, looked incredibly small, frail, and deeply stooped. He was wearing an old, slightly frayed winter coat instead of his usual expensive, tailored wool overcoat. His hair had gone almost completely, shockingly white. My mother looked even worse. Her face was deeply drawn, heavily lined with severe exhaustion, and she looked nervously at the floor as she walked, completely stripped of her usual arrogant confidence. The incredibly heavy burden of their massive financial debt, the loss of their prized lake cabin, and the crushing public humiliation within their social circle had visibly aged them 10 years in merely 5 months. They sat down slowly across from me. They didn't go to the counter to buy anything. The air between us across the small table was incredibly thick, tense, and deeply uncomfortable. My mother started crying almost immediately. It wasn't her usual loud, performative, attention-seeking crying. It was the quiet, absolutely broken weeping of someone who has finally run out of lies to tell herself. "Joshua," she whispered, her hands shaking violently as she reached across the small table toward me. I casually but firmly pulled my hands back, wrapping them warmly around my ceramic coffee mug, entirely out of her reach. She flinched visibly, as if I had struck her, slowly pulling her hands back to her lap. "We miss you so incredibly much," she sobbed quietly. "We are so incredibly sorry for how everything happened with the house. Please, baby, we're a family. We belong together." My father cleared his throat nervously, absolutely refusing to make direct eye contact with me. He stared intently at my coffee cup. "Your Aunt Clara told us about your massive new job and your big promotion. We're very, very proud of you, son. You've really made something incredible of yourself. We went to a funeral last week for your Uncle Thomas." He paused, clearly hoping the mention of death would soften me. Didn't. It really put things into a stark perspective. My father continued, his voice trembling slightly. "Life is simply too incredibly short to hold onto this kind of deep, toxic anger. Carter is really, really struggling right now. He's living in a terrible, unsafe place. He can barely afford groceries. He needs his family right now more than ever. We all need to come together, forgive each other, and heal as a unit." I sat perfectly still, my expression completely blank, letting his incredibly manipulative, highly calculated words hang heavily in the air. Even now, completely broken, physically exhausted, and financially ruined, they were still fundamentally trying to use me. They were disgustingly using a distant relative's sad funeral to manufacture fake emotional intimacy. They were cheaply trying to flatter me with my new job title, desperately hoping I would magically open my newly heavy wallet to rescue Carter from the devastating legal and financial consequences of his own terrible actions. They didn't want a son. They wanted a savior for their golden boy. Life is short. I agreed, my voice perfectly calm, entirely flat, and completely devoid of any anger, heat, or sympathy. You're absolutely right about that, Dad. Which is exactly why I am not going to spend one single second of the rest of my life being the reliable supporting character in Carter's endless, self-inflicted tragedy. My mother let out a sharp, small, deeply wounded gasp. How can you be so incredibly cold? How can you sit there and say that? He is your own flesh and blood brother. He is a 32-year-old grown man who legally trespassed into my home, intentionally and maliciously destroyed my historic property, and criminally stole our dead grandmother's inheritance just to make a quick buck. I stated the absolute, undeniable facts clearly, making absolutely sure the people sitting at the next table could hear every single word. And you two are the parents who actively handed him the key to my front door, helped him move his furniture in, and coldly told me to be mature about being robbed blind on the street. My father finally looked up, a brief, desperate flash of his old stubborn, controlling anger appearing in his tired eyes. We made a mistake, a terrible, stupid mistake, but we raised you. We gave you everything we had. We loved you both equally. No, you absolutely did not, I said, cutting him off sharply, my voice slicing through the air like a knife. You did not love us equally. You secretly drained the massive college fund you promised me since I was a child just to pay off his luxury credit cards. You took out a massive, reckless second mortgage to buy him a luxury Porsche while I worked 2 exhausting minimum wage jobs just to afford community college night classes. You aggressively conditioned me for 30 years to believe that my only actual value in this entire family was how much emotional pain and financial burden I could quietly absorb so Carter could continue to pretend he was a massive success. You gambled your entire retirement, your precious lake cabin, and your public reputation on his pathetic lies. And you completely, utterly lost. They stared at me in stunned, deeply horrified silence. Their mouths hung slightly open. They had absolutely no defense. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't being hysterical. I wasn't throwing a tantrum. I was just calmly, methodically reading the permanent, undeniable historical record of our lives back to them. We just want our family back, my mother sobbed, burying her face in a cheap, brown paper coffee napkin. We just want you to understand why we did it. We were trying to protect him. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. I looked closely at the 2 completely broken people sitting across from me, and I realized with absolute clarity that I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel resentful. I didn't even feel sad. I just felt incredibly, profoundly done. The emotional cord was permanently cut. I do understand, I said softly, leaning forward slightly so they could hear every single syllable. I understand perfectly. But here is the absolute truth that you are going to have to live with for the rest of your lives. You can cry in this coffee shop. You can beg me. You can send Aunt Clara to leave voicemails and guilt-trip me until the end of time. But love without respect is just control wearing softer clothes. And I will never, ever let you control me again. I stood up slowly from the small table. I pulled a crisp $20 bill from my leather wallet and dropped it on the table to cover my coffee. Don't contact me ever again, I said, looking down at them one last, final time. Take whatever tiny bit of money you have left in the world and focus entirely on your golden boy. He's going to need it. I turned my back and walked confidently toward the exit. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped out into the freezing, bustling, noisy streets of downtown Philadelphia. The freezing winter wind immediately hit my face, but I didn't shiver. I took a massive, incredibly deep breath of the icy air. My chest felt incredibly light. The heavy, suffocating iron chain that had dragged me down for 34 years was finally, permanently broken. I was free. Here is what I want you to take away from my story. We are constantly socially conditioned from birth to believe that the word family is a magical, impenetrable shield that automatically excuses terrible, deeply toxic behavior. We are told by society to endlessly forgive, to always be the bigger person, and to constantly keep the peace, even when keeping the peace means setting ourselves completely on fire just to keep toxic people warm. But true, lasting peace never, ever comes from allowing yourself to be relentlessly used and abused. Setting a firm, unyielding boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate necessary act of self-respect. If someone consistently disrespects your property, your massive efforts, and your emotional well-being, their biological relation to you absolutely does not matter. You do not owe your bright future, your hard-earned salary, or your mental health to people who view you simply as an emotional landfill or a convenient financial backup plan. Sometimes, the most incredibly loving thing you can do for yourself is to step back, entirely stop protecting them, and let the brutal, heavy consequences of their own actions finally catch up to them. I want to know if this resonated with you today. If you deeply understand the immense power of walking away from toxicity, or if you found genuine value in my difficult journey of taking my life back, please drop the word good in the comments below, or tell me which specific lesson from this story hit home for you the hardest. Your engagement truly helps this story reach the people who desperately need to hear it right now. Thank you so much for listening, and stay strong.